So in his campaign to attack Greece, Xerxes put together a huge army because this was a campaign that he didn't want to fail. Uh, the Persians had tried several times to conquer the Greeks, and they were not successful as much as they wanted, especially in conquering Athens and Sparta. These two had become very difficult alongside, of course, other smaller city-states. So Darius had failed, Cyrus had basic, some extent you can say failed, even though he didn't really make an effort. Um, the Cambyses failed, he didn't make an effort really to fight the Greeks. Smarties, the imposter, did not make any effort at all to try to conquer the Greeks. Now, Xerxes was keen on changing that. He wanted for the final time, or for the final, or to ultimately make Greeks be under the Persians. And this was his like final push, really. So he put together a big army. Herodotus tells us that the number was 1,700,000 men. That's a huge, huge army. And in fact, he goes ahead to tell us how they were able to calculate that number. He tells us after they had crossed into Europe, before they could go and launch the war, the Xerxes decided to do kind of like a census, you can say, to determine how many people were in his army. And Herodotus tells us that how they managed to count all these people is that they initially, or at the beginning, they created a formula, and this is how that formula looked. They counted 10,000 men, and then they put them together, squeezed them very close, and then drew a circle around them. And then these men left, and then they built a fence around this circle with with an entry and an exit. Now they, because now they knew how many men that space will hold, they will just drive in men until that space is full, and then they let them go. And then that way they were able to know how many people were in the how many people were in the army that Xerxes was leading to fight the Greeks. And the number came to about 1,700,000. Now, this number was not entirely Persian. In fact, Persians formed a small portion of that army. Herodotus tells us it was difficult for him to determine the actual numbers of soldiers that different nations contributed to the army, but he did know, or he did get to find information about the nations that contributed the army. And when you look at that list, it's an international list, you can call it that, especially when you consider the old world in which Persia existed then, and the Greeks, of course, and the other kingdoms and city-states. So this was like an international army that was going to attack the Greeks, and this army was led by the Persians. It had been put together by the Persians, but it wasn't really Persian per se. What was Persian is the leadership. Herodotus tells us that about all the top generals were Persians, and even the officers that were under the top generals were Persians, but the army itself was not really Persian. So in total, they are close to, I counted, it comes close to 50 different nations that contributed to that army. And most of those nations don't exist today, or we don't hear of them. But some are still around, or the names still, then they are mentioned, you're like, yeah, that's still around. For example, the nations that are mentioned that we still have them around is the Assyrians, even though maybe some part of maybe the original Assyrians are not really the current Syrians, but of course the name still Indians, Arabs. Those are some of the names that we still have around. And some that no longer exist is, of course, the Medes, who are very close to the Persians. They were very related. Scythians, we don't have those. Hyrcanians, Bactrians, Sakai, Lydians, Parthians, Caspians, Arankians. We don't have those. Let me add another one that we still have around, the Armenians. Armenians is people we still consider, or we still have them around. So, but in total, as I mentioned, there were close to 50 different nationalities. Some of those are still around, and many of those we don't know where they went, or they've changed, they became different, or intermarried with others, and then they've been others have been conquered, and so they no longer exist. Now, to me, the most interesting contributing nations were those that are African. Yeah, it turned out Africans contributed significantly to the army that Xerxes was leading against the Greeks. At the top of the list were Egyptians, and then Ethiopians, and then Lydians. Those ones contributed men to the army that Xerxes was leading. Now, in regard to Ethiopians, Herodotus tells us that the Ethiopians, because as he describes the entire army that Xerxes was leading, he tells us how each nation dressed. He tells us that the Ethiopians were clothed in skins of leopard and lions, and they had long bows made of a stem of the palm leaf. And their arrows were made of reed, and at the tip of it was, they did not use iron at the tip. They used a sharpened stone that was very sharp, it tells us. They also carried spears, it tells us, and the heads of these spears were sharpened horn of an antelope. And they also carried knotted clubs. Those are the Ethiopians. And it tells us that the Ethiopians came painted, with their bodies painted using white chalk and something he called vermilion. So this painting aspect is so interesting because it's very African to paint our bodies, especially when going to war. It's something every tribe here in Africa is that act of painting the body is very common, especially using white chalk. So the fact that he mentions that the Ethiopian soldiers who came to join Xerxes were painted, it kind of like made sense to me, like those are Africans. And then he tells us that there are two types of Ethiopians who came to this army. They were not the same Ethiopians. He tells us that there were Eastern Ethiopians and there were Western Ethiopians. He tells us that Eastern Ethiopians lived above Egypt, of course, to the south of Egypt. When we talk of Upper Egypt, it's usually south of the southern part of Egypt. So he tells us about this. So he tells us that the Eastern Ethiopians were put together with the Arabians, and then they had one commander. But then he tells us something else that I found very interesting. He tries to tell us what is the difference between the Eastern Ethiopians and the Western Ethiopians. He tells us that the Eastern Ethiopians have straight hair, while the Western one have woolly hair. If you come from East Africa, you especially if you come from Kenya, there are sometimes used, might consider them derogatory depending on where they are used. People who are of Cushitic tribes, and these are tribes that are Somali, Ethiopians, Tigray, people from Eritrea. These people have a different kind of hair. Their hair is kind of like straight. as Herodotus says. And then there are other tribes, especially those of Nilotic or Bantu, who we have very woolly hair. And if you are in Kenya, you will hear people say, oh, nywele ngumu, which is like a word that used as derogatory in a way, especially by people who have straight hair. So Herodotus tells us that the difference between these two types of Ethiopians is that the Eastern Ethiopians have very straight hair, and that made me think the Eastern Ethiopians of Cushitic. And he says that was the only difference. The skin color was the same except for the hair. And that shows that kind of tells me that the Eastern Ethiopians were Cushitic tribes, and then the Western tribes were more of Nilotic tribes. And but he tells us besides that there was no any other difference between these two types of Ethiopians. And of course now he tells us that the Western Ethiopians they wore heads of scalp of horses with ears and men attached. The ears were made to stand upright, blah blah blah. They had shield made of skin of cranes. So the Africans who were part of Xerxes' army were Ethiopians, and mostly when it comes to the land army, it is Eastern Ethiopians and Western Ethiopians that I've described. And when it came to the sea army, the Egyptians, this is where the Egyptians contributed a lot of personnel. The Egyptians provided, Herodotus tells us, 200 ships to the fleet that Xerxes had. And the Egyptian ships joined, of course, the ships from Phoenicia, which were the best, by the way, in that age. Like Phoenicians were considered to be the most skilled when it came to not only building ships, but managing them on water for trade and also for war. So other Africans that are mentioned, Herodotus tells us that there are people known as the Cyprians. I tried to do some research for, I don't know whether this is Cyprus, could be, or could be wrong, but it tells us these Cyprians were mostly a tribe of people that were of very mixed race. And he says that they were a race of people that had ancestors who were Greeks, and they also mostly Greeks and Phoenicians and Ethiopians. So these three races kind of merged to form what the race of people he calls the Cyprians. So yeah, so Africans were part of the army that Xerxes was leading to conquer the Greeks and by large the entire of Europe.